Hello and welcome to this special episode of Politics in the Pulpit, where we explore the intersection of politics and faith in preaching. It is Challenge Poverty Week 2024 in England and Wales this week, and in an important moment to stand together against poverty and advocate for systemic change. My name is Nathan McGuire. I'm a Baptist minister and serve as the Campaigns and Church Engagement Officer for the Joint Public Issues team. Today, we'll be focusing on how churches can play a role in addressing poverty throughout Challenge Poverty Week. I'm joined by three distinguished guests from different church traditions, and I will now invite them to introduce themselves. And I hand over to you first, Hannah.
Hi, it's good to be here. I'm Hannah. I work for the Methodist Church in Britain, helping to coordinate the Let's End Poverty movement.
Thank you. And Simon.
Yeah, again, great to be here. My name's Simon Jay. I'm a Pioneer Baptist minister. For the last 23 years, I've been running a charity in Birmingham that specifically supports people living on the margins. We've been doing a lot of work recently around tackling the issue of food poverty and similar stuff.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. And finally, Neil.
Yeah, great to be here as well. I'm Niall Cooper. I'm Director of Church Action on Poverty and am a member of a local URC Baptist church. So to fill up the third leg of the Joint Public Issues team denominations.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to have all three of you with me today. So if I was to fling out the first question, really, Challenge Poverty Week gives us an opportunity to coordinate and confront together the reality of poverty in the UK. How can our churches reflect this calling in our preaching and actions? And feel free to just jump in.
I would like to start, first of all, I think, because I was thinking about this word poverty. When I read the biblical texts and the poverty and the poor come up all the time. But I would like to just start on reflecting on what we mean by poor. And I think I want to do that, or I've been doing that in the context of our own community centre. And I'm really aware that the language that it's easy for us to use is the people that come into our community centre, they're the poor people, they're the ones that need help. But if I was to say to them and ask them this question, would you consider yourself to be the poor? I don't think many of them would. In actual fact, I think some of them would actually be quite offended. So I've been thinking, in terms of how the church understands the word, this word poor, and what are we really talking about? And there's something for me around a wider understanding of what's going on. So most people that come into our centre, I think they would identify with possibly being isolated, so isolation, or struggling with mental health, or in debt, or feeling disconnected, or being failed by the education system. So I thought that would be interesting to sort of like explore a little bit as we're digging into this word, the poor, is, what do we mean by that? And maybe we need to be a bit more nuance in terms of the people that are coming into our spaces that are saying we need support, we need help. What's going on with that?
Yeah, I think there's something that you started to pick up on there, talking about the language used around poverty and the poor in the Bible, that often throughout the Bible, in the New Testament particularly, the language used around poverty and the poor is really closely tied to inequality, and a language around status. That often people who are named as poor are people who are also oppressed, marginalized by the structures in the society, the way that the community works. It's not an inherent quality that they possess because of who they are, but it's something that's being done to them because of the way the society around them is working. And I think that's something for us to think about. If we're called to challenge poverty this week, how can we turn that around, as so often is done in the Bible, in the Gospels, by Jesus as he talks about the poor?
Absolutely.
To rewrite that power structure in the way that we behave towards one another as a community.
Yeah, because I think our instinct is to think I think we're aware it's not just giving people money, is it? when we're talking about the poor, we're not thinking, right, if people just have more money. Now that's really, I find that really interesting, because the politicians suggest that is the case. They're talking on their language is all around the cost of living crisis. We want to put more money in people's pockets so that they can. And I think that completely misses the point. And I think we within our churches need to be careful that, again, we don't think that poverty is simply about people needing more money in their pockets, the hard-earned taxpayers that are, that whole narrative that comes from our politics.
I think the other challenge when we're talking about poverty in 21st century Britain is the language around stigma.
Yeah.
That poverty's become an incredibly loaded word,
Absolutely.
which is partly why nobody wants to claim it themselves, because that immediately puts them in a position where society is then able to judge them.
Yeah.
And I think churches are part of society. It's easy, I've seen in churches, to slip into that judgmentalism, that what's wrong with you if you're poor? What have you done to bring this upon yourself?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very individualized kind of Victorian view of poverty, that there were deserving and undeserving. And if we come on to the politics, Keir Starmer's speech at party conference has featured benefit fraud as the big issue to tackle. That just front struggling, and they're on the make, and it's somehow it's the people that are wrong, and it's not the systems and structures that are wrong. So for me, the starting point for this is people in poverty are just like anybody else, but struggling, whether that's financially or in terms of access to education or work, or struggling with mental health or disability. But they're not different. They're not making bad choices because they're inherently poor. They're people whose lives are more difficult than many other people in society, but also have dreams and aspirations, and are created in the image and likeness of God just as much as anybody else. So that's, for me, is where we should start this conversation.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And again, I'm really excited about, as we go a little bit deeper in our conversation, to explore some of these themes as well. Just a few dates for those who are leading or preaching this Sunday. At the time of releasing this podcast, it will be Black History Month, an opportunity to celebrate the resilience and the gifts that people from Black and Brown communities have gifted us within the UK. It is also going to be International Day for the Eradication of Poverty on the 17th of October, and Anti-Slavery Day on the 18th of October. But before diving deeper into our discussion, let's just set the context in the UK for us. I want to read a quote from an article recently written by Paul Morrison for the Methodist Recorder, and Paul is a policy advisor for the JPIT team. He writes this: the latest data says that in the UK, 14.3 million people are experiencing poverty. Of those, it is the young who are most affected. Almost 1 in 3, 30% of children experience poverty. 21%, or just over 1 in 5, working age adults experiencing poverty, while pensioners have a poverty rate of 16%. That is a massive turnaround from a generation ago, when almost half of the UK's pensioners experienced poverty. Over the past 35 years, there has been a huge rise in property and other asset prices, alongside large increases in the state pension and a means-tested benefit now called pension credit, which has driven this change. I'm just going to read some of the lectionary readings that preachers will be focusing on this particular Sunday. So the first is Job 38, verses 1 to 7, Hebrews 5, 1 to 10, Mark 10, 35 to 45, and Psalms 104, 1 to 9. Hannah, Simon, and Neil, are there any specific passages from this week's lectionary readings that particularly stand out to you when you think about the church's role in tackling poverty?
I think this week's readings are fairly challenging. Some weeks are easier than others to connect to a theme. The one that I picked out was from Mark. The challenge, I think, in this passage is the two disciples think that they want status. Zebedee, James and John, sons of Zebedee, though they want to be on the kind of top table with Jesus and sit at his right hand. And Jesus, in his lovely way, just kind of pushes them back, says, it's not about exercising authority over people. That's the model. That's not the model of discipleship and leadership that I see and want. It's servanthood. So it's flipping it on its head. We need to be the servants of people and not exercising authority over them. Now, how does that relate to poverty? When I talk to people in poverty, they have a really bad time with people exercising authority over them, whether that's benefits officials that just sanction them seemingly for no reason, whether it's councils that send bailiffs in a fairly inhuman way, that they have a really tough time with people that think they have got the right to judge their lives and control what they do. And that's not the model of servant leadership. How as churches do we see our role as being servants and being alongside and recognizing the dignity and humanity of people themselves? So that really puts us into a very different position to how society starts when it talks about poverty.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting in that passage to think about who Jesus is talking to there. He's got his 12 disciples around him. It's two of them who kind of push that question on him first, and the 10 who he kind of turns to address afterwards. They are people, a group of men who have been nominated into a position of leadership by being disciples of Jesus. They're adopting this role of leadership. Jesus isn't talking to people who are already having to exercise servanthood or service because of their position in the community and society. These are people who have been, nominated into these positions of power, and because of this, we can see some resonance between that and the passage in Hebrews that's kind of drawn out in this week's lectionary around what does it mean to be a leader. How might we exercise this servant leadership that Jesus describes both here in the Mark passage, but also in the Hebrews passage, that is about service, that is about humility, recognizing the needs of others first and prioritizing the needs of others as leaders. And I think particularly in the context of Challenge Poverty Week, when we think about who are we challenging, what are we challenging, who is in a position of power to change things, what would servant leadership in that context look like that might begin to turn things around in the way that we respond to poverty in the UK?
Yeah. And I think leading on from that, actually, so when I read the readings, I was trying to see where the actual, if we want to use this language, where the poor were positioned in it. And Psalm 22. So I've read Psalm 22, and it's got some pretty graphic language in it. Obviously, it starts off with my God, why have you forsaken me?" And this was something that Jesus said when he was also at the cross. It's got, "But I am a worm and not human, scorned by others. I am poured out like water, and all of my bones are out of joint. My heart is wax." I was thinking, wow. For it says, "For the dogs, they surround me." And I was thinking, wow, this is some pretty serious stuff that these people are feeling. But then it was like, but who was feeling this? So obviously this psalm, it's a psalm of David. This is David is associating with these this language with this understanding of himself. And Jesus, again, Jesus was associating with this language. And I was thinking, how interesting would it be if we are connecting some of these struggles and this deep heart cry with people who we consider are on the margins, who are poor, who are struggling, who are suffering, then we're seeing them in the image of Jesus. They are, in actual fact, they are associating themselves, or should I say, Jesus and even King David are associating themselves with, if you like, the poor. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if the church, we understood that the people, and again, we come back to, for whatever you did to the least of these, you did for me. If we associated, if you like, the least of within our society as royalty in the kingdom of heaven, how would that change our churches in terms of our response to people who we consider to be the poor? These are people who are royalty in the kingdom of heaven. And I think that was very different, again, coming back to the in Mark and the story of the rich young ruler. Jesus switches that around. So I just think he centers the poor again. He says, sell all the stuff and give it to the poor.
Yeah, and if I might draw in that during Challenge Poverty Week this year, as part of Let's End Poverty, our campaign, our call to action is focusing around ensuring that people with experience of poverty are around the table when political leaders are making decisions about poverty, about tackling poverty, about the services and support that people need in that context. There is something about the trust and respect and value that bestows upon people who have that experience of poverty to recognize and say, your perspective, your contribution is integral to the way that we make change here. I need you as an equal partner in the conversation here about how we make change that shifts status, that shifts power. This isn't just about listening, writing down some notes, moving on and making a decision behind closed doors. It's about saying you need to be partners in this with us because we value and trust the contribution that you bring because of your distinctive experience. That is a practical outworking of what we named earlier as the image of God in all people, particularly that distinctive image of God that we see in people who have experience of poverty, who have been on the margins, who have been marginalized. That is really important for us to build into how we behave as a society, and for political leaders, people in positions of power, to build in how they behave as leaders, so that we see that humility that's expressed in the Hebrews passage and in the Mark, that practice of humility, of servant leadership that is about turning to the other and saying, I need you to do this, and I do this with you in this position of change that I hold.
And I think what's true for politics is true also for the church, for ourselves. And so much true. We have this model of we are the servants, as Simon was saying at the start. It's about us serving other people, and the agency in that relationship and the power in that relationship stays with us. And we need to flip that round. I take so much inspiration from people who are struggling, who I call my friends, who are doing amazing things, who, in spite of the difficulties in their lives, are the people that are kind of transforming their communities, who have hope and passion and a burning sense of wanting better for their communities. And in our churches, we need to kind of clear away some of the baggage that people who come through our doors are in need of, are vulnerable, and it's us that brings the change. If we spent more time just getting to know people, respecting their story, and listening to their dreams and hopes and aspirations, and putting them centre stage in what we do as churches, where dignity and agency of people is at the fore, I think that will be transformational.
Yeah.
It's not building friendships and partnerships of equals, and what together is our mission in this community.
Yeah.
And that means that's challenging because people have got different ways of talking, different ways of behaving. They don't necessarily know the way we do things in church. And I think we have to be humble enough to say, well, those things need to go out of the window if they're becoming impediments to actually recognizing and hearing people and being equal with people in their lives and in their hopes and in being human together.
Yeah. So I think a question that I want to ask, because if we've been talking, I've been thinking about this, is, so we talk about equality. So we're starting from a position of you have those that are, let's call it, the wealthy or the rich or the people that feel empowered. And we're talking about how do we bring those that feel disempowered onto an equal level? Now, I wonder if we need to go further than that, you see, going back to, who are the poor and how Jesus saw them. The idea that the least of us shall be, being given a higher seat. Come and move up, he says, into the higher seat and stuff. I wonder if we need to go further than that. And rather than saying, okay, how do we enable people to sit on the same level as us? What if we were saying, actual fact, how do we step back, step down in order that people that we consider to be socially excluded, struggling on the margins, mental health, actually become above us within our church structures? I mean, we have a real issue, obviously, in politics, a huge issue, as we know, that it appears that so many of our politics come from a certain social class, an upper certain social class, with all the privileges associated with money and education and stuff like that. And I do go into a lot of churches and a lot of Christian institutions, and again, I'm feeling the same. And as I'm looking around, I'm seeing actually about who are the people that we welcome in to our churches that are on the margins, and they're sort of like slightly at the back, maybe helping out at the sound desk, doing the teas and coffee on the welcome door. Oh, isn't that nice? They've got the person on the welcome door just, and they say, that's a good job for you. Very rarely do I see them at the front, giving the sermons, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think you called out there something, Simon, that I was thinking about this isn't a task of accommodating people.
Yeah.
This is a call to reimagine how we understand our life together. And reimagining that includes a variety of experiences and perspectives and opinions, because that will take us beyond something that we know at the moment. That's God's invitation to us, is to reimagine together what better community might look like, that models something of what God's character is that we see in these passages, that we see kind of throughout the Bible, and particularly in the life of Jesus. How might we reimagine the way that we live together that models that better? It's not just about rearranging the furniture.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's about getting out the building completely. And I think there's a challenge for us, particularly as we think, for some churches, we might be thinking, this Sunday is Challenge Poverty Week. We're going to do a service here where we think about the issue of poverty. That's great. And we're so delighted that you're thinking about having that conversation this Sunday, but don't let it just be this Sunday because it's Challenge Poverty Week.
Yeah.
Create this as an opportunity for you to think together as a community. What do we need to do differently? What challenges do we need to put to ourselves about who we are together, and how we are perhaps marginalizing people who are within our community, who have a different experience of life, or people who don't feel they can be present with us because of the barriers, that Neil was talking about earlier, those barriers that we often create in terms of accessing worship. Don't make this the one-off. Perhaps use this as an opportunity to open up some of those questions this week.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I'm certainly hearing strongly from us is how we understand greatness. Because in many ways, what Jesus is doing in Mark 10 is reorientating the disciples, which desire he's not necessarily challenging, but he's saying actually your understanding of what it means to be great is wrong. And he reorientates that for them. And just coming and digging a little bit deeper then, especially with what you've just said, Hannah, how can churches reimagine their gathered worship and also their scattered worship? What does it mean to have to step back, as you mentioned, Simon, to step down and co-create that space where people have equal access to decision making within our own communities before we go out and be prophetic, as we all are so inspired to be? What does it mean to be authentic in our own community first? What does that look like?
Yeah. So for me, I think I'm a pioneer Baptist minister, so I will confess that, and you get an idea of therefore where I come from. But for me, one of the issues that we have is the boundary that our gathered churches have. They are really tricky places for people to cross that boundary into our churches. We spend all this time thinking, how do we get people in? How do we get people in? How do we get people in? And people don't come in for all sorts of reasons. And what I want to do when we're talking about it, it's about hospitality. It's easy for us in that place of empowered, say, come into our space and we will host you. But by doing that, you need to obey our laws, our purity rituals. This is the way we do things. This is how we sit. These are the songs we sing. But we are the host. We keep control. And I would just say what we need to do, or what I'd encourage us to do, is for us to become the guest in the space of the other. And if you look at actual fact the gospel and you look at what Jesus did, is Jesus, not only did he step down from heaven and became a guest within the planet, he actually spent most of his ministry being the guest, allowing himself to be hosted by the other, whether it would be the woman that washed his feet. I mean, what a humbling experience. Whether it be Zacchaeus, who said, come into my house and I will feed you. Again, another woman who brought him water. And I think that's a much more scarier place for the church to be. I think we're very comfortable saying, come into our space. I wonder what would happen if actual fact we, again, reimagined church and said, what would it be like to actually be a presence where we allowed ourselves to be hosted and looked after and fed and watered and washed by those on the margins. So that's the generic idea. You can come up with some practicals of how that may look like and what that may look like.
I'm a massive advocate of the Poverty Truth Commission process.
Exactly.
And we're actually going to be trying one with the churches in South Manchester, within the churches. So it's 12 people with different experiences of marginalisation in a room with 12 people that have got leadership roles within the church, not as a one-off, but as a regular meeting once a month for a year, which gives you the space to actually build deep relationship. It's about deep listening. It's about sharing food together. It's about learning to really hear each other's stories. And that's an incredible leveling process. We did one in Salford a few years ago, and just one of the exercises, one of the questions was, when did you show courage? And it was a great leveler, because the people in poverty in the room had incredible stories of the courage they had to use and to face the challenges, the hardships, their lived experience of life, and that the civic business leaders in the room, well, I ran a 5K, or I did this. It's like, oh, okay, that wasn't real courage, was it? It's like it forced humility, and it forced people to see actually to respect a new level of respect for what it is for people going through tough lives, living on the margins where they don't feel respected, lots of things.
Yeah.
And to get to know people as people first, and then say, okay, what's the story? When we put together all our stories, what's that shared story? What's the shared vision? But to privilege in that process those on the margins, that they create the space first and we come into that space. I'd love more churches to do that, to have the courage, rather than we've got this project, we've got this aims, these are the rules, and you come on this basis, to kind of literally throw the doors open and say, let's just spend time together, have a conversation, build relationships, and see what emerges, and to give away control of that process, and to trust actually that's the gospel lived out. That's good news being lived out, and it's transformatory because people that never get heard get the opportunity to shape the conversation and to bring the insights that are never otherwise brought into that kind of space.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think both of what you've both just said paints something of that picture for what a kind of big vision of what better looks like in these spaces. And I think that's absolutely where we have to start from. If we don't have that aspiration for kind of that complete transformation of how we gather together, we're not going to travel in the right direction. I think sometimes it can feel a little daunting, can't it? If that feels like a long way from where we are now, how do we get there? What are the steps that we begin to take? I think, Neil, you've helped us pick apart there something that's really about building relationships with one another. But I'm particularly thinking about how do we reimagine what our worship spaces might look like in kind of, I suppose, a traditional context, particularly in a Methodist church. We'd usually have people up the front leading a service, somebody who might be preaching, someone who might be leading prayers. There's a challenge for us initially to think, who are we hearing from in that space? Whose eyes are we seeing through when we reflect on the passages that are brought to us, in the lectionary readings, in the passages that we might hear from the Bible that Sunday? Whose experience is the lens that we are using as we reflect on the Word of God together? Can we challenge ourselves to think about shaking that up a bit, thinking about who do we hear from, and privileging the reflections of people who had different experiences, particularly of poverty and marginalisation? That's not just about inviting people to tell their story or to share their experience with us. In fact, it might not even matter that we know that, but it's asking them to share from their perspective, where do they see God in these stories that we gather around in this space of worship? Where do they see God in the world, and what do they want to pray for?
Absolutely.
So I think that there's maybe a first step, a challenge for us to think about who are we hearing from in our gathered worship. And how might we be able to shake that up a bit?
Certainly. And one of the resources that we have on our website in partnership with Church Action on Poverty actually is some questions that people can use in their small group settings, and also potentially even use for reflection after a particular sermon, that again, asking those very simple questions. Where do you see God in your own story? Where do you see God working through you? And a variety of other questions as well that people can use. I'm just mindful of the time, and I kind of we've talked a little bit about kind of us as Christian communities and kind of what we might need to do differently, what we might need to do to reimagine our worship spaces, or how we go on mission or engage in a wider community. But what can we do to challenge the systems? What does that look like within the UK? How can we challenge food insecurity and change that? Just for an example, what can our congregations do?
I don't know if this totally answers the question, but I want to talk about one of our, precious sacraments, the Eucharist or communion or whatever, because I always wonder about this. I've written bits and pieces about it. So talking about food poverty, can you imagine if you are genuinely struggling to get food, you're very hungry, so you go to this church service that's advertised, come to the church service, to our communion service, the abundance, the Lord's table, and the abundance of God's, God's food and provision for us. And you come in there and you have a tiny bit of bread at some point, or a wafer and some drink. And after the 1.5, 2 hours, you leave, you're even more starving than what you were before. And I think that, wouldn't it be an interesting idea if we actually, thinking about tackling specifically food poverty, if we actually made this meal a meal in our churches? We centered our church services around a meal, but it's not a meal that's like, say, cucumber sandwiches. It's a meal that all are invited to participate and eat. But just like, because I say this because I think Jesus may have done that a couple of times. But where so much food then is produced, you have this leftoverness that people then can take home and share with their neighbors and share with other people. The meal continues throughout the day. So I think that is one really interesting thing. But again, coming back to the point, what happens around meals? You see, because this isn't just about feeding. This isn't food banks or even food pantries. This is just not about feeding people that are hungry. What happens around meals? Relationships happen, build, develop, and stuff like that. So again, coming back to this whole question, how do we reimagine our church systems and structures so that at the very core it just automatically starts challenging how we behave and how we relate to one another?
I think that's a really interesting point. Just thinking about as you were sharing, especially coming from a Caribbean background, actually, we would often have an open door policy. You'd kind of cook more food than what your sort of household could eat, with the expectation that others would join you randomly. So you'd get auntie so and so, uncle so and so, your cousins coming around, and that sense that, again, migrant communities, global South communities carry that sense of hospitality, that widenness of their table. It's always ready to be opened up to more people.
Yeah.
I think certainly drawing on that, and it's certainly why we love our cultural diversity Sundays that we make, International Sundays or Pentecost Sundays, isn't it? Because everyone's bringing in that food from a variety of different cultures, from sandwiches all the way to jollof rice, and that sense of that spread that's being put on. Whether we could somehow make that systemic within our worship life and see it as an act of worship would be really interesting.
Absolutely. A friend of mine wrote in his book, he said, the only practical thing that Jesus left us with to build church is a table with food on it. And I just thought, whatever you think about that. Yeah, when we look at our church services, and there's nothing wrong with anything. They are heavily weighted with obviously singing worship, with preaching, and so often it so saddens me that this Eucharist, this breaking of bread, this sharing of food together is tagged on in somewhere as a very solemn, very serious, very quiet, very individual, once a month sometimes thing.
I'm glad, Simon, you mentioned pantries, because we're at Church Action on Poverty, we're real big advocates of local pantries. Your local pantry network has got about 50 churches and another 150 more organisations running them. What for me distinguishes them is that they're a membership organisation. So it's not people coming for a charity handout.
Mm-hmm.
If you come to a local pantry, you come as a member.
Yep.
And it's your pantry, and you pay a small weekly fee. Mm-hmm. So the relationship is totally different.
Yeah.
And it's about social interaction. It's people coming every week. It's quite often having coffee and chat, as well as getting your food, choosing what food. So it's building community. Fundamentally, it's using food to build community and dignity and choice and hope. And it's fantastic for me when I hear of churches that do this and say, we never knew these folk were in our community. And now they're coming as members, and now they're wanting to volunteer, and it's their place.
Yeah.
So they're not coming to our place. There was a wonderful story soon after lockdown. One of the churches in Liverpool had to close for worship, but could continue functioning as a pantry. And the person that welcomed the congregation back after the end of lockdown was an ordinary community member who had become a pantry member, and it was him welcoming back the congregation to their building because it was his building and his pantry. And that was so lovely for me about turning those tables again, that a space where anybody in the community feels not just welcome, but feels this is their place and they've got a stake in it. And it's about hope and not a place where you go because you feel a bit rubbish.
Yeah.
It's a place where you can celebrate being a member and the relationships you've built and the friendships you've got, and tell each other, the stories of hope you want and the dreams that you've got. And for church to be that space is, again, incredibly transformative. Opening up, sharing power, respecting difference and different people's stories.
Yeah.
And that's what gospel, again, feels like in practice.
Yeah, and I think there's a challenge for us as we gather around these tables, as we share in these spaces, to think about how do we deepen the friendship that begins there into solidarity? How do we carry from that place, not just an experience of friendship, but an action of solidarity that says, I will live my life differently because I know and love you, and to ask one another what a good solidarity looks like as we go into our lives. And that might mean taking action. It might mean engaging in campaigns for justice that call out where injustice is present in our communities. It might mean running our households differently, and using the resources we've been given differently, in solidarity with our neighbours. So I'm a real advocate for prayerful action during worship, to say that our spaces of worship don't need to be separate from the places that we campaign. We take action prayerfully. So actually, as we gather, in our Challenge Poverty Week services on a Sunday, what prayerful action might we take together to raise our voice, to commit to change, whether it's in our own immediate sphere of influence or whether it's challenging our local political leaders or our national political leaders. That is part of the way that we deepen that friendship into solidarity, I think.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful place, I guess, to draw our conversation today to a close. And before we wrap up, I want to highlight that the Joint Public Issues team has launched the Constituency Action Network, which was launched at the beginning of September. We're encouraging churches in every Westminster constituency across the UK to actively engage with their MPs, and there's going to be loads of opportunities to join in with brothers and sisters, people from other denominations, on campaigning on issues of poverty, to challenge poverty, to see it ended. And I'd encourage you to check out the Let's End Poverty website, Church Action on Poverty's website, and also the JPIT website. We're seeking to really provide resources to equip and to encourage churches to build that meaningful relationship with their MP and be a contact point for them for the wider community as we seek to centre people with lived experience of poverty at the heart of our policy making. I really want to thank you, Hannah, Simon, and Neil, for sharing your insights and really enriching just even myself, for example, and I'm sure some of our listeners will be grateful as well. To the listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with friends or colleagues. You can continue the conversation with us on X, Instagram, or Facebook. And you can also visit the Joint Public Issues website to find more resources. But before we go, why don't we close with a prayer? Let's pray. God of justice, you invite us to walk in your ways of justice, showing compassion and standing in solidarity with those who experience poverty. Grant us the courage to confront systems of oppression and forgive us when our silence and inaction uphold them. Inspire us to work deeper and harder together, lifting up the voices of those who experience poverty, so that their wisdom shapes the policies in our country to create lasting change. May our prayerful, worshipful action reflect this commitment to ending poverty. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.